This is CitySCOPE, a podcast on cities and inclusive economic development, live from New Haven. I'm Kate Cooney, so glad to see you all here tonight. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the podcast and the Inclusive Economic Development Lab, and then we'll kick off. So this CitySCOPE podcast is an outgrowth of the Inclusive Economic Development Lab at the Yale School of Management. We started in 2019, so a lot of our work has been virtual. That's why we're so excited to have our first live event and gather so many of the people that we've connected with through this work. So we have James Johnson-Piett with us tonight. For regular listeners of the podcast, James needs no introduction. He is frequently on with us. But for those of you who have not met him, James is the founding principal and CEO of Urbane Development. He's an evangelist for a new kind of community economic development that emphasizes community anchor businesses and institutions as agents of change, solving local problems and elevating the quality of life for underserved communities. In the 15 years that his firm has been in business, he's worked with 100 communities or more across North America and the Caribbean, and over 1,500 small businesses, representing 1.5 million square feet of commercial and community facility space, and helped raise over $225 million for small business and community development initiatives with the goal of promoting community wealth generation. Their firm focuses on community anchors, on community wealth building, on diaspora, on small business solutions in both the formal and the informal economy. And recently has been involved in some larger scale developments, such as the Flatbush Caton Market, and a really cool redevelopment in the Bronx of an old Modell's that is now home to a mix of fresh food purveyors, discount retailers, CDFI incubator, and a childcare. Yes. So James, you've been such a part of this project from the very beginning, and we couldn't really have our first live event without you here. Thanks for joining us. The theme of tonight is meeting the moment with inclusive economic development. How would you describe the moment that we're in? Inclusive economic development appears to be the in vogue phrase. We're coming out of COVID. We have a tightish labor market. What are you seeing on the ground about both the opportunities and the challenges of the current moment?
I think we're at an interesting inflection point. First, thanks for having me. Excited to be in person. Feels a little weird to be staring at people, but glad we're here. I think we're in this space where there's an inflection point between the sort of current system and sort of the aching of people to really have more autonomy, sovereignty, and focus on what they want to do. And whether or not that's investing, whether or not that's land use and real estate in their communities, whether or not that's small business generation, the whole model of spaceship shows up because developer or politician or somebody in power decides they want something to be there. The very top-down approach is really being pushed back at in a really fascinating way. It's not that it hasn't happened in the past. It has happened in the past. But I think what's interesting is I like to say a lot of old concepts like cooperative economics, the idea of sort of community ownership in a real sort of tight way is showing back up. But now you have technology, you have data streams that are occurring, you have social media, you have all these things that accelerate the opportunity and get people who wouldn't necessarily be part of the conversation to be part of it in a much different way. And our guests will definitely talk about that in more detail. I think about the Robinhood phenomenon. So if you haven't been checking the news, a couple of years ago, Robinhood as an app shows up and makes the idea of buying securities or equity in companies a lot simpler. They gamify it a little bit, they make it fun. And so all of a sudden you see hundreds and thousands and even millions of investors deciding who you're going to invest in. So GameStop, which was a brick and mortar buy your video game in space concept, which in this current environment makes no sense. All of a sudden it was a run on that stock because a group of people said, you know what? We're going to mess with the marketplace. whether because you like GameStop or because you want to mess with sort of the securities markets. We're going to make a run on this thing. While that's happening, you have the reemergence of a really interesting set of players at the community level wanting to buy their own real estate, want to, cooperatively think about businesses. And so at the meta level, you have all these things around retail, right? So whether it's storefront or whether it's retail investors wanting to make their own choices about things. And we have an infrastructure now that doesn't allow for that in lots of ways around investing and around real estate because of what happened in 1933, what happened in 1829, what happened in 1845. Like you could go back, in terms of the things that we're guarding against around the system and just being chipped away at. So I think what's really neat about inclusive economic development is the first time people are chipping away around the infrastructure that keeps inclusivity from actually happening, right? Where people at the individual level can make choices for themselves about where they want their money to go, how they want their communities to grow, what you want to be able to invest in, et cetera. And so models like the ones you're going to hear about today are the action that's starting to show up and bubble up all over the country. So that's really, really exciting to see.
Yeah. We have Stanley Tucker here with us tonight. Stanley Tucker is the president and chief executive officer of Meridian Management Group, which provides financing and surety bonding and various kinds of debt and equity financing for small women and minority-owned businesses in the state of Maryland. In fact, Stanley has been in the business of supporting and scaling minority and women-owned businesses for 50 years. Described as working with a mix of creativity and pragmatism, Stanley is recognized for creating some of the most innovative programs in the country. Stanley, in terms of meeting the moment, you have a strategic plan underway in Maryland to meet this opportunity of the current era to build wealth for small minority and women-owned business enterprises through supplier procurement initiatives as the country prepares to invest heavily in new energy and infrastructure. What are the opportunities you see in the current landscape for expanding this work?
Well, my partners and I, we see it as unprecedented. And we want to maximize this opportunity, particularly for small minority and women-owned businesses. We've been working at this for a long time. We are entrepreneurs. I started off as a government employee. However, I'm an entrepreneur. My parents are entrepreneurs. My grandparents are entrepreneurs, and my great-grandparents were entrepreneurs. I always knew I was going to be an entrepreneur. So we developed a strategy, and the strategy is around capital, because our mantra is capitalism without adequate capital doesn't work. And I don't care where you are, it does not work without adequate capital. So our strategy was to put together what we call a continuum of financing products. And the strategy was focused on, depending on where a company is in the life cycle of its business, when they walk into our door, that's what we look at. So we structured our financing products so that we'll be able to birth a company, and we could stay with that company to a strategic exit, including going public. So we could birth them, we could grow them, we could really position them so that they could hire as many people as possible, because part of our results, our quantitative results, is that we want to show the economic impact of our investments. And we've done that, and we had an economist look at our data over a 10-year period, and it shows that for every dollar that we receive, particularly from the state, the state received $10 back in taxes. So they've seen that that's a pretty good investment, Kate, okay? And initially we started out with the largest loan that we could make. This was back in 1981, was $150,000, and specifically focused on providing working capital financing for government contracts. So that was all that's where it was. When I first got there, my partner, I recruited some of my partners. We all went to school together at great Morgan State University, no offense. And we laid out a strategy where we wanted to provide debt, equity, as well as surety bonding. And so we've expanded that out. We expanded out, like I said, we started with $150,000. Now we could go up into the millions. And since we have our first African-American governor, we said we have a new sheriff in town, we put together what we call the Westmore strategy. And it's an aggressive strategy. For example, the max loan or investment, et cetera, that we could put into a company, and we have various components. It's about $2.5 million. Well, we are increasing that per company from $2.5 million to $10 million per company. Surety bonding, similar. So the strategy is to really move these companies to another level, if you will, and really, bottom line, is to create wealth, particularly in the small minority and women-owned business community. And so it's not magical, okay? It's pretty straightforward, but what you must have is capital, okay? And if you look at the minority, women-owned business community, the only thing that's holding us back is capital. Remember I said, capitalism without capital does not work, okay? So it's straightforward, it's not magical. That's what we do. And we put together various strategies. For example, we have a franchising component. We started out with franchising because we realized with franchising, you were in business, but you're not in business by yourself. So we started a franchising component that just focused on helping our clientele get involved with franchising. The International Franchise Association was so impressed with it, they gave us a national award, so we want to expand that into multiple franchising units, if you will. Why are we doing that? Because our data shows that the industry in the area that has generated more African-American millionaires is multi-unit franchising, and we understand that very well. So we are putting that piece in place. In Maryland, they are spending billions and billions of dollars coming into the state, infrastructure, as well as offshore wind, because where Maryland is located on the eastern seaboard, they're right on the water. So they're gonna be building these huge windmills off the shore in 3 areas. Baltimore City, Sparrows Point, Prince George's County, and Eastern Shore. They are giving an example in Baltimore City where Sparrows Point, U.S. Steel used to be there. At one time, they had 500 employees. You know, U.S. Steel is not as big anymore. However, they've totally redeveloped it because of this offshore wind. It's going to generate huge dollars coming into the state of Maryland. Another major project is MagLab. It's the bullet train coming out of D.C., stopping at the airport. So actually, going into Baltimore, Newark, Delaware, Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Newark, New Jersey, downtown Penn Station in New York, less than an hour. The dollars that's going to generate is going to totally change the landscape of Baltimore where we are. So right now, if I have a meeting in New York, I catch a train, get up there, and around in about an hour, hour and a half now. Well, not now, it used to be about 3 hours. With this MagLab, I could get on that train, it comes out of DC, I could be in New York City, Penn Station, less than an hour. So these kind of projects, and all this is going on simultaneously, so the amount of opportunities are literally huge. It's unprecedented in Maryland and really along the seaboard. So we want to be in a position, we position ourselves to be in a position so that small minority women-owned business maximize all of these opportunities, but they can't maximize it without capital. And so we have this strategy where we want to generate and provide more capital so that it can really lift all communities, if you will, along this eastern seaboard, which is probably has more wealth than anywhere in the nation, and possibly on the planet in this corridor. And so we want to maximize that for our community, small minority and women-owned business communities. That's a brief overview. I can go into more details and about how we thinking about planning on implementing this strategy.
One more thing I want to highlight about the many creative ways you've approached this work is what you've done with gaming legislation as that came into Maryland, and what you are hoping to do with cannabis legislation as that came in terms of capital.
Yes, we're always looking for ways to get capital. When they brought gaming in, we did our research and saw that a lot of people of color in these casinos gambling money. So, but they had to get legislation through to bring gaming in. So we approached the Maryland Legislative Black Caucus, and we presented to them. We said, look, we want to put in the legislation where 1.5% of the gross proceeds from video lottery terminals to go into a fund to invest back into small minority and women-owned businesses. And we got it through. And so that money has been flowing. I think it's generated over $100 million thus far. And that money will flow as long as they gamble. And so our strategy and to put things in law so that it's there, that money will continue to flow, Kate, until they change the law, okay? So until they change the law, that money flows, and that's capital. With recreational, in Maryland, they approved a referendum where they're going to, with recreational marijuana. So, what we want to do, went to the Black Caucus and said, look, we want to duplicate what we did with gaming. So we said we want to look at it two ways. We want to look at either 2% of the gross or 10% of the taxes. So we did some more additional research, and we looked around the country, and it looked like most of the states were looking at the tax piece. So we did our analysis and saw which one would generate more capital. As it turned out, it was very close, okay? And so in doing additional research on which strategy would be the best to get it through the legislature, we determined to go the tax route. 2% versus the growth, or 10% of the taxes. And so we're getting ready to introduce that in this coming session. We are looking at playing with the language right now in terms of what we will find out with. Either way, we think we'll be successful in getting the legislation through. Again, at the end game is capital, because our close, remember, capitalism without advocate capital does not work. Thank you.
We have Adriana Abizadeh here with us today. Adriana is currently the executive director of the Kensington Corridor Trust in Philadelphia. The mission, duty, and purpose of the KCT is to utilize collective ownership to direct investments on the commercial corridor to preserve culture and affordability while building neighborhood power and wealth in Kensington. Adriana is the president of Catalyst Consulting Group, a boutique consulting firm specializing in strategic planning, leadership development, and board governance. Her expertise is in supporting grassroots organizations with growth strategies and the development of welcoming and inclusive work cultures. Previously, Adriana served as the executive director of the Latin American Legal Defense and Education Fund in Trenton, New Jersey. Many cities are experiencing the gentrification pressures on housing markets that can accompany the inflow of high-income households, creating these central business district renaissances surrounded by neighborhoods feeling increasingly squeezed and pushed. Tell us about the Kensington neighborhood and how this neighborhood trust meets the moment. What is it about the neighborhood trust that sparked the interest of the residents of Kensington to try this economic development tool?
Thanks, Kate. Okay, let's see. So Kensington, similar to New Haven in many ways. Philadelphia as a city broadly has about 1.5 million folks, so a very large urban center. Philly is America's largest poorest city, so in terms of socioeconomics. Our neighborhood has about 32,000 folks living inside of it in 6 census tracts. And the average household median income there is about $24,000 a year, which I understand to be similar also to New Haven. I think Kensington has been a place that has been long time kind of abandoned, abused, left behind, forgotten, not thought of, intentionally dumped on, continue that list of descriptors. And folks in the neighborhood have been organizing for a very long time. Right, so folks in this neighborhood have been saying, we can't afford to stay here anymore. We don't see businesses that reflect us. We don't have opportunities for home ownership. We don't have opportunities to take on the bricks and mortar on our corridor. There's a ton of vacancy. There's a ton of light. We are the hub and center of the epidemic around active drug use and sale, sex trade. We have a very high vacancy rate. So our corridor pre-COVID had, for the commercial businesses, a vacancy of about 10 to 30%. Flash forward now, a couple years into COVID, I have certain blocks that have vacancy as close to 60%. So it's a very, very high vacancy corridor in comparison to so many other corridors around the city who have bounced back fairly quickly with, reinvestment of specific types of businesses and specific supports that have been available in those communities. And so in Kensington, folks were advocating for safety, just general safety, general public safety, for their health and their well-being, their general wellness, the ability to afford and to stay in their neighborhood. And when we are thinking about Kensington broadly, as we are having a conversation about gentrification and displacement, the number one question that we're always asking folks, particularly when we're outside having conversations about what is the risk of not investing in Kensington, right? What happens if you choose not to invest? Where do folks go when they live in the lowest income, most affordable neighborhood in a city? Where do you go next? And if you can no longer afford to live in the cheapest neighborhood that exists in your city, I legitimately want someone to tell me, where do you go next? Right? And the very kind of common next question is, well, folks are gonna live multifamily, right? So we're gonna have more folks occupying units than it's safe to do so. We're gonna have more unhoused folks, right? We're gonna have folks who are having to take on additional work responsibilities and labor responsibilities in a market that oftentimes isn't compensating them for their value and their time. And so folks are becoming more precarious, right? They're getting in more precarious situations and more dangerous situations because we've built an environment for that to occur. And we're allowing that to occur. And we're allowing systems to continue to extract in every way possible, right? Extract in our rent, extract in our labor, extract in our knowledge. And so in Kensington, I think it was kind of primed and positioned to be able to think about alternative ownership, to think about steward ownership, to think about collective ownership in a way that perhaps other neighborhoods kind of quite aren't ready to yet. And I think Kensington also benefited from the fact that it had large institutions, right? So we're not a meds and eds neighborhood. There are tons of meds and eds neighborhoods in Philadelphia. That is not us. But we do have really strong community development corporations. We have a really strong federally qualified health clinic. We have some pretty strong private developers who are trying to think about kind of a double bottom line, right? How do they do social impact and good along with or alongside extraction? And I think that's a double-edged sword, and it's a difficult line to keep, but they're trying. And so those folks came around the table and they said, no one is wholly and solely focused on the corridor. If someone doesn't focus, we're just going to continue to see increases in vacancy. We're just going to continue to see increases in blight. We're just going to continue to see increases in public safety concerns, in actively utilizing folks, drug trade, sex trade, gun violence, because no one is paying attention. And so these folks came together. They built the Neighborhood Trust back in 2019, so similar year. Really kicked off at the top of the pandemic. So I joined the KCT in March of 2020, just as the pandemic was really taking off, and really dug into what is it that we are building? What are we building? What is a neighborhood trust? Right, so it's a new concept. We've talked about community land trusts. We've heard about business improvement districts. Everyone is familiar with the traditional community development corporation model or the traditional private development model. But what does it mean to build a neighborhood trust? What is it that we're actually doing? And so we spent a lot of time defining that. We spent probably the first year and a half, 2 years that I've been at KCT just defining that. Who governs this, right? How do we create space, make tables for residents and small business owners to directly control this work? I want you to tell me what you want me to acquire. I want you to tell me what type of capital you want me to accept. I want you to tell me how you want me to redevelop this building and with whom, right? How do I prioritize local economy? How do we really build in solidarity economics into our work? And then most importantly, how do we reactivate this space for the collective benefit of the folks who live here and who work here and who have businesses here and who worship here, right? And are maybe just commuting on the L. Maybe you're just coming by. The L is the elevated train. We have an elevated train over our corridor, right? So how do we make sure that everyone who's touching this neighborhood is really benefiting from that reactivation? And after really long and difficult conversations around positionality, around race, around income, around education, around access, around capital, and the lack of access to capital, we decided that the trust needed to be governed by residents and small business owners first and foremost before anything else could happen. So we had to transition from our founding institutions. There was 4 institutions in Kensington that formed and founded us. We had to transition from that to be neighborhood-led. We then had to begin doing acquisitions, which meant we had to attract capital. And very quickly we realized that when you are going to govern and collectively own assets for the purpose of affordability and localized control, you have to play in a very tight margin of capital, right? So I can't go to traditional market. I can't go to a CDFI. I can't take on 5, 6, 7% interest rates. And so right now, KCT, all that I spend a ton of my time doing is traveling and talking with folks who have the capacity to give capital at 2% or less. Because if we don't take on capital at 2% or less, 10 years from now, we're going to be forced to exit these assets because we can't afford the debt load, right? And so if I want to mass assets quickly, if I want to rehab them or build new construction if it's a vacant lot, bring in small businesses from the neighborhood, right? And so there's a priority for that as well, right? We're prioritizing Black and brown, women-owned businesses from Kensington. So the first 3 businesses that we've brought to the corridor, 1 is already successfully in place, 2 more are in process. They are all residents of Kensington, right? Who have otherwise would not have access to these spaces because of access to capital, because of understanding the pathways. Just even traditional, right? James and I have had this conversation, just formalizing your business structure, right? Like, what does it mean to have a commercial activity license? How do I set up my taxes, right? How do I bring on staff? And then really making sure that folks are in alignment with our own racial and social justice values, right? We want folks to pay living wages. We want folks to be concerned about the amount of hours that their staff are working. We want to make sure that they're not being abusive of labor and that they are valuing time, because that's in our own ethos, right? That's in the fabric of who we are at the Neighborhood Trust. So all to say, it's been a lot of work. It's been really hard work. I think we are finally at a place where we're starting to see sustainability, where we're starting to feel like, oh, this could really work. Like, we could do the thing, right? We've finalized governance. It is 100% neighborhood-led. We've begun acquisitions. We've begun leasing. We have sustainable capital, right? We're starting to see revenue come in from the tenants who are, on the residential side and on the commercial side. So it's all starting to kind of piece together now. And I think we're in a place of like, okay, we built the thing. Now we just have to keep going and keep going. And so we're working on a 1.4 mile long corridor. So it is an expansive and long corridor. There's about 627 assets on that corridor. We own 15. So I am small fish, right? I'm still very small fish. But We are trying. And so we've been acquiring at a pace of about 5 assets per year. And we typically at any time have about 2 assets in rehab, moving towards potential and future leasing.
Where? Exciting. Very exciting. Just a couple follow-ups, and then we'll let everybody follow up for real. Where are you finding the capital that's coming in on your terms? And just give us a flavor of the governance dynamics.
Absolutely. So the capital, not easy to find. Start there. I'm sure Stanley could tell you, right? I'm over here saying, I won't take capital past 2%. Stanley's like, what? Yeah. So primarily foundations, taking it from their corpus, their endowment, right? So an alternative form of investment, taking out of traditional market investment and putting it directly into place-based investments. We do have one individual investor who also met the foundation terms, so at 2% or below. That's it. I have one CDFI loan, one. And it is only because it was a pass-through from CARES. So we got it at 0%. Otherwise, I would not have touched it. And so it's a very interesting fundraising strategy in that it requires so much front-end education. We were talking about this too, James and I. It takes so much education to say to a foundation, no, you can take your money out of the endowment and invest it in a place-based strategy. It doesn't have to live in the market. Somebody a long time ago advised you that that's what it had to do, but like I promise you, legally, you can cut it over here. You can watch it grow. You will get your 1 to 2% dividends, 0% preferred, and it'll be fine, right? It's the same level of risk as you would with any other type of risky investment, right? And in this one, you are value aligned, right? So in a moment in which, right, and to Stanley, right, all of the success of Stanley's been at this work 50 years, is that what you said? Way before it was cool, right? We talked about things being in vogue. Nobody was talking about black and brown women-owned businesses 50 years ago, not at the scale that everyone wants to talk about it now, right? Like it wasn't the buzzy thing. It was hard work. It's hard work now. It must have been incredibly hard then. Yeah. And so really prioritizing folks who are value aligned with us, that has been very challenging, right? So it's not just you can give me 2% debt. It's you can give me 2% debt and you are value aligned with us. Right? You understand the value of this work, the importance of this work, and the patience that it requires. Because we are not working at the pace of the market. I was having this conversation with somebody from the audience earlier. We're not moving at the pace of the market. We're moving at the pace of trust. Because these are residents and small business owners who are governing. And so if that means I have to take 3 extra weeks to say, are we going to acquire the thing or not? That's what we're going to do. And does that mean that sometimes we're going to have to pass on an asset? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Right? But that's what we're about. We're not about just making quick, rapid 1 + 1 = 2 decisions. Obviously, my portfolio has to pencil. Obviously, I need to be able to repay debt, but that's not the only guiding factor. And so then to the governance. So we were institutionally governed for the first year-ish that I was at KCT. We are now neighborhood-led. So our board, we have 2 governing bodies. One is a 501c3 traditional charitable entity, IRS. Everybody knows what a nonprofit is. The other is a perpetual purpose trust. They're hybrid linked to each other. There's a legal construct that kind of intermingles their finances and their governance. On the 501c3 side, at least 30% of our board must be residents, current or former. We acknowledge that folks have already been displaced out of Kensington, and so we didn't want to lock those folks out of being able to govern. Current small businesses have to make up at least 30% of the board, and then no more than 40% can come through invitation only from the residents and the small business owners to represent institutions. So currently on the 501c3, I only have 1 institution represented. It is not one of the founding members. It's the federally qualified health clinic at the corner of Kensington and Allegheny. They are the single largest health access point for the neighborhood and one of the largest, if not the largest, employer for the neighborhood. And so they were very intentionally invited by the residents and small business owners who see them as a partner. They value having them at the table to govern alongside them. So on the other half of the structure, the Perpetual Purpose Trust, that governing body, very similar, slightly different. 2 folks have to be residents, 2 folks have to be small business owners, 2 folks have to be young folks, so 16 to 24 residents. 2 folks have to be neighborhood leaders that do not have to live in the neighborhood, but I'll tell you the 2 that were selected for the first body are. So these are like your neighborhood captains, your local community development corporation executive director, maybe a community organizer that's well revered but perhaps doesn't live in the neighborhood. They could fall into those seats. And then the 9th seat on that body is an overlap from the 501c3. And the 501c3 board was built in advance, was built before the Perpetual Purpose Trust. When the Perpetual Purpose Trust governing body was being built, which is called a Trust Stewardship Committee, those folks said, we don't want these two bodies of governance to feel isolated or siloed. And so we want there to be an overlap. And so that 9th seat is someone that serves on both boards. That person must be a resident or small business owner. Those are the only two categories that can catch into that 9th seat. So that's governance.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So James, we've heard some really exciting things tonight, and you're in so many conversations over the 15 years that you've been doing this work. You've really been seen as someone who's got, a vision about what it could be, and what, from the conversations you're in right now, just to kick us off into a conversation with the audience, what are some of the things that you're seeing at the bird's eye view that you're excited about, that you think could be really transformational? I mean, not things you hope could happen, but things that are happening right now that you think are really going to take us someplace new.
I'll give two really quick examples. So Adriana and I have been on the road show for the last, I feel like at least year and a half.
At least.
So there's I don't know if you read comic books, but if you look at Professor X and Magneto, there's sort of examples of they both have a vision for a beautiful future for mutants. And I think what you're seeing right now in the economic inclusive space is sort of these various versions of the theme of the same thing. How do I get to the same place with all these different models? So I think her model is super dope, and it's really intentional about affordability and sovereignty. I've been in conversations where folks have talked about perpetuating affordability at all costs. I want to understand my land. I want to get small businesses capital. But the overarching theme of it is community members having real direct choice on how all plan plays out, and building systems to make that happen. Whereas the other way around tends to go down. Typically, a system is imposing on you to do something. And so what's happening, I think, nationally, you're starting to see the idea of community wealth. You heard that term again and again and again. I started my company in 2008, and I talked about community wealth. And in my mind, I was like, it means lots of people coming together and creating a collective balance sheet, right? So when you think about a business that has a profit and loss statement, it's about what money comes in and out. But then the balance sheet's about what you own, right? And in my mind, it's like, I grew up in North Philly, and my grandmother owned a shopping center along with 400 other parishioners of Dr. Leon Sullivan's, Enon Baptist Church. Again, 1968, right? These are not new concepts. They just got supercharged now. So I grew up in that space where my grandma showed me the P&L for the shopping center when I was, a little kid. She's like, this is your birthright. This is what you own, right? And so all you're seeing now is an explosion of opportunities in that space where cities, and I think I'll give you a quick Google to do, or Bing, or whoever you like to use now. Chat GBT, whatever the new stuff is. Look into Chicago's community wealth building initiative. So the city of Chicago and the mayor, Lightfoot, just put up $5 million to seed an entire department focused on community wealth building. So she's saying she's putting down both land assets and RFPs, procurement, supply chain assets through the city, and this idea of land banking. So how do we take all the sort of city infrastructure and move those things through a community wealth building lens? So she's saying, I need the CDCs, the perpetual trusts, what we do is the community investment vehicle model. All these models start to show up. Hey, here's some public assets, you run with them, you see what you can do as a collective ownership model. In Oakland, there's the East Bay cooperative sort of folks. They're doing their thing. They're grabbing properties. Nico, there's a neighborhood REIT in Echo Park in LA. Same deal. The Little Tokyo folks, you have Japanese communities trying to preserve their commercial corridor in Little Tokyo in LA, where seniors are really underwriting young people and collectively trying to own their block, right? Cleveland's doing something funky with like a sort of remix of the Democracy Collaborative work around anchor procurement. My point being that there's this whole sort of igniting of these ideas at some kind of scale, and everyone's putting their chips in with actual projects. Like we're not at the like ideation phase anymore. People are actually putting money down, organizing, and putting money into projects. What's interesting is the natural continuum this sort of stuff takes on, because from affordability to limited equity co-ops, shared equity concepts, to investment trusts, to more traditional models where you're just doing crowdfunding. There's a whole continuum of capital that's out there, and sort of the governance that belies that capital is really fascinating too, because in each model, you have organizing that has to happen, but for what purpose? So you have community having to ask questions of itself about what it wants for its future. Mm-hmm. So with our model, it's more of a vehicle model. So we're saying, look, you own shares in a vehicle. Collectively, you own this vehicle, and the vehicle is going to decide what it wants to do with its balance sheet. So in those cases, you're a shareholder, and you're having conversations with other shareholders. Some shareholders may say, you know what, I want to cash out and move to Florida. Another shareholder may be like, you know what, I want to double down, put money into a school. It's for the community to decide what they want to do as shareholders, right? In other cases, you have a very clear purpose to your trust. Their trust says, I want to do X, right? And so what's interesting about all this is that now at the policy level, the White House is taking notice of this. It has implications around the SEC, around the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. All these old artifices around how you invest are now being shaken up a little bit. And I think, to me, it was cool. It's agnostic of red or blue. Whether you live in Kansas or you live in New Haven, everybody wants to have more autonomy about where they spend their money, how they spend their money. But obviously, the risks that come involved around understanding the investment opportunity has to be thought about. So now, I think of it as akin to affordable housing. So 30, 40 years ago, the Community Reinvestment Act sort of set off a whole chain of events that created an infrastructure for affordable housing. So now there's tax credits and there's intermediaries and this whole infrastructure that didn't exist in 1971 that now exists now as a whole interrelated infrastructure between the federal government, local players, capital, technical assistance, et cetera, et cetera. The same thing's going to happen with community wealth. I think in the next 5 years, you're going to see federal policy coming down on high, state, and a lot of what Stanley's talking about, these new industries that are going to come through, who's going to own them, and it's going to interlace between, frankly, the delta between the marketplace and what the value point that it's worth for, and what subsidy is going to occur to sort of make the difference up. And in affordable housing parlance, it's all the sort of per unit subsidy, right? That's what a Section 8 voucher essentially is. So when you think about it from that perspective, the government's paying for X, the marketplace is Y, the delta is going to be the difference between what the government pays and what you pay, right? And there's a whole system that's set up to allow for that to happen, because otherwise, a lot of folks can't afford where they live if they didn't have Section 8. Same thing's going to happen with this community wealth space. And so I think what's really fascinating is there's all these different models. They're all in a sort of past their infant, they're in toddlerhood, and they're all sort of stumbling, trying to figure out how they're going to work out. And what's cool about it is it's all place-based. What works for New Haven is going to work for New Haven. What's going to work for Kensington is going to work for Kensington. And it's up to everybody in the room to figure out how they want to move. So I'm really fascinated to kind of look back and see what's going to happen with folks, in terms of their products here for sure. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, join me in thanking our guests for being with us, and then I'm going to invite you to ask them some questions. Happy to take questions. Yeah. Donna.
Good evening, and thank you for your presentations. One of the questions I want to ask, I want to direct it to Stanley in particular. When we look at, for example, potentially going into a recession, how does that impact the capital that you're trying to secure for the businesses that you're trying to secure it for? What's the exponential impact of capital to those particular types of businesses, particularly when the market goes down?
Well, we look very closely at the industry in which our business is in. And one of the things that we've learned that we aren't square box lenders or investors. We look at the company, what we call do a situation analysis. And depending on where they are in the life cycle of their business, and depending on what the market looks like, then we try to structure the financing based on the situation. Because if you're a square box lender or investor like banks or traditional venture folks who also could be pretty structured, you're not going to really realize our mission. And so depending on where they are and where the economy is, and what's going on in the global aspects of the economy and in the industry in which they're in, then we try to structure the financing based on all of those factors. And what we have found is, have we lost money? Yes. But based on our mission and based on what we've learned and looking at the situation and structure the financing based on the situation, then we've made out pretty good, which is why we are able to attract capital. And also what really helps us with our investors, both private and public, on the public side, the return, from the state and others, in particular the state has put money in us, they get that 10-to-1 return. So they said, okay, guys, we like that, okay? On the private dollars, we are giving them back their return, and when we do that, we put the private dollars into, particularly the equity dollars, into companies that has a higher growth rate. And that can get tricky, and this is where really having experience and understanding the management team and the entrepreneur, because that's key, okay? And so we can get comfortable with the entrepreneur, even though there's risk in everything. We can get comfortable with the entrepreneur, then we'll take, because we are in business to take risks. Actually, we were created to take more risk than traditional financial institutions and traditional source of capital. Not excessive risk, okay, because we still have to get the return back, but we were created to take more risk. And part of that, and anyone that's in lending or investing, you really try to get a feel for the character of the entrepreneur, And if we feel as though that the character of the entrepreneur is good, then we're willing to invest. We've made investments into companies that were in bankruptcy. Well, why would you make an investment in a company that's in bankruptcy? Well, we looked at the situation. What happened? Why? What happened with the entrepreneur? So we can get comfortable in asking those questions, okay, particularly the character of the entrepreneur. That drives us, okay? As I said, we invested in folks that were in bankruptcy, but we get a feel for, if you've been in this long enough, and we have, you get a feel for the character. Things happen that's out of their control. And so we take that into consideration. We could get comfortable with the character. We have a strategy that we could help this entrepreneur and this company move forward. Then we'll take the risk. There's risk in everything. There's no such thing as a riskless investment or loan, et cetera. There's no such thing. Okay, so that's kind of how we take a look at it. We were created to take more risk. I hope I answered your question.
Yes.
Hi, Jim Nicholas, Black Business Alliance. Well, for a lot of the small entrepreneurs that you're working with, what type of contingency plans do they have? And that's number one. And I know, I'm laughing, right? and actually, how do you evaluate the management team?
Well, let's start with the management team. Okay? Because at the end of the day, it's the management team that makes it happen. Okay? It's the entrepreneur and the management team that makes any business work, or it doesn't work. Okay? So we sit down with the entrepreneur and his or her team. And we have a face-to-face discussion, okay? And we ask them questions, we get their response, and if we are comfortable with what we responses that we receive, even if they've had problems, okay? Because business is such that things happen that you really don't have any control over. So depending on how they respond to us in their situation, like we said, we put money in companies that were in bankruptcy. But their response to us, we take that response and we go back and do our due diligence. What was happening in the economy at that particular point in time? And if we could get comfortable with the management team and looking at the circumstances, where the economy is, where they want to go, how their industry, their strategy, if we get comfortable with it, then we'll take the risk. 'Cause there's no such thing as a riskless investment, even if you have collateral, okay? Because the collateral may be worth something at this particular point in time, but it may change. You know, so we've learned a lot over the years, but that's the exciting thing about this. It's not square box, and we are allowed to be as creative as we possibly can to make it work based on our mission, okay? And my partners and I, we've been doing it for a while, and you know, we love to sit down and figure things out. Because it's easy to say no, you know? But it's very exciting to sit down and use your intellect and your experience in trying to figure out how a way to say yes, but that yes makes sense to us.
Yeah. Do we have any questions for the Neighborhood Trust side of the panel? Yes, Paul.
Adriana, I'm fascinated with the 2% and lower investment. Have you had any?
I am too.
In fact, I'm going through a little bit of that right now. But with have you had any interaction with banks? I haven't heard a lot about banks tonight. And I was in banking for many years, and we did 2% loans in investments at some points. I was just wondering, is that a way that you can get investment dollars as well?
So no, not at this time. I have some CRA dollars on the grant subsidy side, but we do not receive investments. So right now, all of my investments are from private foundations with the exception of two. One is from one CDFI at 0% through CARES, and one is from an individual investor who invested at foundation terms. No banks. And I think it's to the box. They're in a box. And I think, you know, the Kensington Corridor Trust and the Neighborhood Trust model is very new. We were formed in 2019. There's only two of us in the nation. It's us and Kansas City, Missouri. We utilize the legal framework in separate ways, but we are both legally neighborhood trusts. And there's risk involved, right? It is not a riskless investment. It's actually a high-risk investment. No one has proven that you can perpetually hold assets affordably, intergenerationally, to build wealth at a community level, and at some point take direct investment from non-accredited investors, right? Much to the SEC conversation that was had earlier, from non-accredited investors from a neighborhood who oftentimes don't have the financial literacy required to even make investments, right? They're not typically investing. So there's a ton of education on the front end that's required to then get these investments. And then folks want to cash their investments out. So you're right, so you have to constantly have a rotating pool of investors as well. And KCT is not yet taking direct investment. We are priming and getting there in the coming years. I think banks will probably come. I think there are two ways in which we may take on bank lending in a future moment. One is through the perm debt on the properties. So at some point, we'll need to exit the program-related investments that we've taken on from the foundations. So that is a space for that. I think the CDFIs are also, there is a space for that. Because once the asset is generating revenue, I can pay close to market returns. I don't know, preferably not, but I will probably have to at some point, right? Like the model will evolve to that point. So I think that's one space. I think the other space is just when we de-risk. Right, when we get to a point where it feels less risky and I fit inside the box and the portfolio is larger, right? It's not 15 assets, but maybe there's 50 assets. I think we'd be more primed to have ongoing conversations. But no, I mean, like, I'm trying the banks. It's not for a lack of like making phone calls and sitting in meetings and doing a million Zooms and, you know, making the pitch over and over and over again. But the values have to align and the capital has to align.
Banks are regulated. Okay.
I'm sorry, and we don't accept equity investments. That's the other
That's
thing.
a big.
We do zero equity investments. I only take entity level non-secured debt. On top of the fact that I'm playing games trying to get 2% and below, I don't take secured debt. So if you're trying to put a lien on my property,
No happiness.
there's no in between with me. I don't live well in the gray. I was having this conversation with someone earlier today. I'm very black and white. I'm either all in or I'm all out. So it has to be 2% or less. You cannot debt my property. So I don't take lien positions on any of my debt. You have to be willing to take long and patient terms. So all of my terms are between 10 and 15 years. Right, I'm not taking short, we were having this conversation, I'm not taking 1, 2, 3 year terms.
Right.
I can't turn it around that fast. I'd be putting the entire model at risk.
Right.
And so is there a later point in time when we absolutely could? 100%. It's not right now, it's not at inception.
Your strategy has to be aligned with the capital that you have.
Yep.
If it's not, it's gone.
And that was the point I was making earlier. That's why there's a continuum of these opportunities, because hers fits within box A, his fits within box C. There's 19 other boxes. And so when you're talking about banks, the private wealth side of the banking house that might be looking for concessionary returns, they could possibly fit. So if you're talking about the 5 to 8% range, so you're sort of playing around with risk profile. So for real estate, you should be in the mid-teens, but you're saying, hey, you're an ESG bet, you're an impact bet, we want you to move over to the left. There may be high net worth folks that they're managing your money to throw it into. It might be your bank's corpus, et cetera, that thinks about that return as well. But that's a box, right? The issue and the opportunity is to start breaking some of these walls down a little bit and think about the capital as more of a blended opportunity. That's where I think the next mile is. It's the grant maker with their corpus, the grant maker with their PRI capital, and the grant maker with their grants, taking 3 different pockets that they have and putting them all up. So then your blended rate's 2% because you're talking about 5% money, 3% money, and 0% money, and negative money coming together for one purpose.
Yep. Yeah, spot on to everything he said. So the blended capital and the integrated capital is critical, right? So I can't just attract all debt. I also have to go find subsidy. At some future point, KCT won't require subsidy. The model won't require subsidy because it'll be generating revenue from the leasing. And at that point, I could take on the higher level debt, right? Let's call it 5%. And blend it, with my 1% and land at 3%. For sure, right? Like I'm not blind to the fact that I'm playing in a capitalistic structure, right? Folks want to make their money, folks want to make their dividends.
Absolutely.
We're just trying to make sure that I'm making off the back of these folks who are low income, black and brown folks who've been extracted upon plenty enough. And so we're just trying to make sure we can preserve affordability and control. And that means being very intentional about the type of capital that I take on.
Just call it risk adjustment, which is what it is.
Or just don't call it risk.
You're really, exactly. You're just
How do we
really,
define
really
risk? Who defines risk?
Exactly.
Right? I have this is part of the education factor we're having all the time. When folks tell me that KCT is risky, I'm like, to whom? To whom? What's the risk of not investing? What is the risk of not investing? So yeah, we need to redefine risk. Who defines risk? I'm not defining risk.
Thank you.
Of course.
We have time for one more. Malcolm?
This is a question more for the community trust. So Kensington is gentrifying, and so you talked about acquiring properties at like 5 properties a year. Hopefully that rate increases.
We pray.
But given your situation, like how do you influence whether it's developers, other entities, or even like politicians, given that there's a mayor's race in Philadelphia this year, to work on behalf of your residents?
Excellent question. Okay, let's see. So I think one, it's acknowledging that some folks don't want to, right? And I was having this conversation with someone else before we caught up here, into these fancy chairs, which is that I don't want to be in every room. I intentionally don't want to be in every room. There are rooms that I want to be in, and there are folks that I want to rub elbows with, right? And it's these kinds of folks. There are rooms that I'm not interested in being. I don't care if I get invited. I'm okay with that. If you don't have Kensington's best interests at heart, I am not interested in being in your room. Why? Because you're just going to harm. You're going to cause additional harm, whether it's in the capital, whether it's in the policy making that you're having, right? But that also means that on the side of your room, I have to be trying to advance policy, which is a lot of what Stanley does, right? I have to advance policy. I have to be before city council. I have to make testimony. I have to write legislation. I have to do all of that on the side of trying to build a model, trying to finance a model, trying to help small businesses. So there's constantly moving parts. I think specifically to like private developers and the speculators who are in Kensington, we've taken on some of their assets, right? So it is about also building bridges and having conversations with folks like, yeah, I get that you'd really like to hold this for 10 more years because it's going to be worth a lot of money in 10 years. But you also could just exit it now. You can take a cute little thing on your taxes about how you didn't sell it at market, right? Like, and you can feel good. You want to do a press piece? We could do a press piece. If that's going to make you feel good, I'm happy to take a picture. Let's take a picture in front of the community garden. Let's do it, right? Like, definitely trying to understand what is your motivation, right? My motivation is accessibility, affordability, long-term control. If your motivation is press, let's do press. If your motivation is you want to acquire a different parcel, let me free up this capital for you so you can go over there, right? Maybe you have something, you have a play that you're trying to make, and I'm not trying to play in that field. I have 1.4 miles. That's my play. 627 assets. I am wholly and solely focused on 627 assets. The other thing to keep in mind is that KCT, under no pretense, do I think we will ever own 627 assets. We don't want to own 627 assets. Ideally, the small business owners who are there are owning their own buildings. KCT is built for the plug. I'm built for the small business owner who can't afford to take on the building. They don't have the credit or the capital to take on the building. They haven't tested their business model long enough to take the risk of purchasing a building. Right, buildings build wealth. Is it risky? Right, so how do we define wealth? How do we define risk? KCT is interested in taking on things that have been speculated upon, things that are being extracted, that are being extractive. The private developers who are coming in and gentrifying, those are the things I want to take on. Absentee landlords, of which I have so many, that's what I want to take on. So we're never going to own all 627. That's not the strategy. That's not the goal. The goal is take on what we can, preserve affordability as we can, acknowledging that the neighborhood's already gentrifying and displacement is already actively happening. So I'm working in the face of an existing condition. It's not that it's coming. Gentrification is here. I'm trying to work around it. I'm trying to preserve, if this pocket just got gentrified, let me buy this. So at least those families who live in those spaces, or if I can rehab it and keep folks in, that's the priority, right? KCT, we are anti-gentrification, we are anti-displacement. I cannot stop gentrification. I cannot stop displacement, right? It's a mitigator. I'm a gap closer, but we'll never fully collapse. The system is too large and too fast. The market, capitalism, is far too fast. I hope that answered, okay.
Let me say a point in terms of my partners and I, and we just started out with a fundamental concept. And that concept was and continued to be, there's a lot of talent out here in this community, particularly in the African American women community. And our approach is, what can we do to help these folk realize their dreams? I'm a dreamer. My parents were dreamers. And God has given us intelligence. And if we think about it long enough, and if you want to do it, you can figure out a way to do it, whether it's a square box, whether it's a triangle, whether it's a rectangle, to make it fit that situation. And that is our approach. You can't, you can't structure every deal the same way. It won't work, especially with our population, okay? It won't work. And so we've learned, and it's fun actually, trying to figure out how to structure it so that you can reduce the risk, and you can do it. If you can Because when you're educated to structure deals a certain way, especially in banking. If it doesn't structure, you don't do it, etc. And even conventional training tells you do it this way. Well, for our community, that doesn't work. Okay, so we decided that we were going to become creative in structuring deals, but yet in our structure, we could see our way through. Some deals we take to our committee, and we don't make the final decision ourselves. We have to take the deal to a committee, and sometimes you look at us and say, Stanley, what in the world are you guys? What are you stretching us now, you know? He said, well, it's about stretching. You know, our mission is about stretching, you know? And have we lost money? Yes, we have. Have we made money? Yes, we've made a lot of money, okay? So when you look at the mission, okay, and when we go before the legislature and when we go before the investors, we look at it and say, here's our return. And from the state level, there are two kinds of returns. There's the monetary return, and then there's the economic development return. Okay, because we are creating jobs, we bring tax. Like I said, the dollar that we get, we give them $10 back, you know, in taxes. So you look at the return itself and you try to match up the strategy with the returns based on the source of capital because we go to different sources of capital. We have conservative capital, we have less conservative capital, okay? We get venture capital, okay? And sometimes we mix them all with the idea of getting each one of them their return. Does it work all the time? No, it doesn't. But overall, long term, we have a pretty decent track record. And it's fun. You know, it's fun for us. Now stretch our thinking, you know, how do we make this work, you know? But particularly if you get comfortable with the entrepreneur. That's key. That's really, really key. That's what we've learned. Get comfortable with the entrepreneur. Usually we could figure out how to get our money back and make some money for our investors.
Oh, I want to jump in real quick about your question about the mayor. And I'm putting you on the spot because I got an agenda.
Oh.
So the main thing is, I think anytime you have an election where all your city council seats are coming up, or you have 11 candidates for mayor, that is further opportunity to start messing with systems. Because they're all looking to sort of differentiate themselves,
Yes.
get above the fray. And then right now in Philly, there's not a single candidate who's above anybody else. It's anybody's game. When it's anybody's game, you can throw all the chips on the table. So I'm just saying to you, Adriana, I think all the head beating you've done around the policy work, I feel like there needs to be a KCT-sponsored community wealth building forum for these 11 folks to show up and sort of like sit under the fire and talk about this stuff. I will happily work our work game with you to make that happen, right? For sure. Because I'm like, that's what it is. Because I'm like, I know you don't want to be in the room. Make them come to you. Make them come to you.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Make your own table.
Absolutely. So I've been saying, like, I think there's an opportunity right now. Because anyway, several conversations about the efficacy of their campaigns, but I'll just say I think there's an opportunity to sort of put this on the front.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank our amazing panelists.